do another video. I'm in my basement because it is cold and wet outside. And I want to stick with poetry for a bit and leapfrog over Yeats to talk a little bit about Eliot. And maybe start thinking about some things we can say about modernism as a broader historical, cultural, artistic movement, and look back with some possible connections to or distinctions from what we got in the Romantics and the Victorians. When I came down to the basement, I found my college edition of the collected poems of T.S. Eliot, published by Faber and Faber. I don't know if they still publish this edition, but I saw it for years and years and years and years, and for some reason, it was to me an emblem of what the big kid English majors got to read and carry around. So I still have it. So let's go to the wasteland. We'll come back to Prufrock. But I want to start with the wasteland because there's a problem, I think, with the poem itself, and with trying to read the poem in a class like this where we're doing so much material in such a short amount of time, and with using open educational resources like our free textbook online. Now, I'm a big advocate of OER. I'm a big believer in using free textbooks whenever I can, not just during the age of COVID, when it's hard for students sometimes to get to the bookstore at school. And yes, you can use Amazon, but getting the right edition can sometimes be tricky. And there are concerns with financial aid and the application thereof. And look, textbooks for English classes, they aren't like the $100 textbooks you get for chemistry or biology or whatever, except in a lit class like British Lit 1 and British Lit 2. We used to use something like this. This is the old Norton Anthology of English Literature, and this is the second half. This is just this thick thing. What we're doing in this course is a separate one for what we did in Brit Lit 1. They don't publish this like this anymore. They publish it in 3 separate sub-volumes, and getting them all together, it's 3 figures at least, and how many of you are going to want to keep this on your shelves forever so that someday you can drift back down to the basement and say, oh, look, here's the textbook I used when I was an undergraduate and I still have it now. It's just a lot of money to spend. So like I said, I want to use open educational resources free online whenever I can. But sometimes, here's the problem, they don't always have the most best editorial or critical material. For example, The Wasteland starts off with a quote that uses Latin and ancient Greek, and they provide no translation of it, much less historical or cultural context for it. And if you can't read it, you skip over it. That's an epigraph. It's a quote that begins a poem or a novel or a chapter of a novel, and you expect the reader to see it and recognize it, and then later make some connection to say, oh, I get why they put that there. Because it makes sense and it helps you to understand the text. It illuminates something about the text. Here you get no translation at all, and so you just skip over it. Well, I want to give you the translation, or a translation. I have to hold the book up to my eyes because I'm old and even with my reading glasses I can't see so well. Translation goes a little something like this. For once, I myself saw with my own eyes the Sibyl at Cumae, hanging in a cage, and when the boys said to her, Sibyl, what do you want? She replied, I want to die. Period, end quote. Sibyl, S-I-B-Y-L, title given to the women who served as prophets of the god Apollo, sometimes also associated with the term Pythia, P-Y-T-H-I-A. That's at the Oracle at Delphi, and what they would do is they would inhale vapors, which were thought to be vapors given off by the decaying corpse of a giant snake defeated by the god Apollo. Who knows if there were any such things or what the vapors themselves really were. but they would inhale the vapors and not at all, get high, and have visions which would supposedly come from the god Apollo, and then they would relate them, and then priests would translate them. And so this particular Sibyl, the Sibyl of Cumae, Cumae, one of the most, if not the most famous of the prophetesses of the god Apollo, was still there, and she was horribly ancient and old, and as they say, trapped in a cage. I mean, it wasn't just like, hey, I served the god Apollo, but now I'm out of here, time for retirement. I mean, they were trapped, and they did what they were supposed to do until they died. Well, these boys see her, and they come up to her, and they say, sometimes want is translated wish, instead of saying, what do you want? For what do you wish? And her response is, I want to die. You know why? Because she was either granted or asked for immortality. And the god Apollo granted her immortality. But she forgot to ask for eternal youth. And eternal life without eternal youth means you simply, without limit, age and weaken and decay. And all she wanted was a release from that gift. So here's how the poem The Wasteland begins after that title, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. It begins with an agent of the divine, presumably blessed by the divine, begging for and not able to receive death. Contrast that with the mood of the poems of the Romantics and their interest in and love for the natural world and beauty, and yes, romantic love. Or contrast that with the Victorians and their interest in an objective approach to nature. But nature is a thing that can be managed or controlled or tamed, right? With the Industrial Revolution, or the natural world is represented by the wilds of Africa and the man who would be king. It's an image of, in this case, failure, being trapped, of endless wasting away. And yeah, it's depressing. But I think it also gives us a key into what the modernists were doing as opposed to what those who preceded them had done. We'll pick this up some more later, but here's your introduction to The Wasteland.